Since its first release, Rode has added quite a few firmware updates to the Rodecaster Pro, but by far the biggest one so far has been the Firmware 2.0 update. This update adds a whole host of new features, and I'll put a link down in the description to Rode's website where you can see every single thing that it does, but I wanted to cover just a few of the big ones that I think are the most impressive. In order to install the firmware update, you just need to plug in the Rodecaster to your computer through the USB cable and then open up the Rode Firmware Updater app. I will say that for me, I had an issue where the Firmware Updater app was only going to firmware 1.5. And so I went to Rode's website and downloaded specifically the 2.0 version of the firmware updater. And then that let me install the 2.0 version of the firmware. So just make sure that you have the right updater. I'll put a link directly to the 2.0 version in the description. And then after that, you just click update and it takes 1 or 2 minutes and then you're all set and you have basically a brand new device. The version 2.0 firmware seems to have a few specific goals. One of them is just to clean up the interface, make things a little easier to find, easier to use. But the other one really seems to be dedicated to people who use the Rodecaster for either more than one show or share it between more than one person. So there are a lot of features now that make it easy to switch between settings for different shows or just entirely different workflows. So just right off the bat, you can see this in some of the updates that they've added to the sound pads. The Rodecaster has 8 pads, and now you have a lot more functionality. Right on the screen, there's now a music note box that lets you see exactly how much time is left on a sound pad once it starts playing. That is incredibly useful, especially for things like jingles where you need to know how much time until it runs out. It can just help your overall production run a lot more smoothly. The indicator also matches the color of the pad that's playing, so it keeps everything much more organized visually as you're recording and playing all these different sounds. You do have a lot more options when it comes to the pads directly on the Rodecaster. If you tap that music note icon, you can then see all of the cues and sound effects that you have on your pad. You can then take it a step further and you can actually change the color for the pads right on the Rodecaster. You can even record directly from one of the inputs to the pads, and you can adjust the pad functionality, whether it's latch, replay, or play. And they added in a new pause functionality. That is really useful for things like interviews or longer clips where you want to play a little bit of it, pause it, maybe talk about it or discuss it, and then keep playing some more. That's just a functionality that didn't exist before. If you want to add in a pre-made sound effect, you do still need to plug the Rodecaster into your computer and then use the companion app. It's super easy. Just drag in files and then they're all set. But one of the biggest things this update does is add sound pad banks. So you can now have up to 8 different banks of sounds for your sound pad. So 8 pads times 8 banks is 64 different batches of sounds that you can have. And of course, that could be for different shows. So maybe one bank is for one show. You've got your theme songs, you've got your cues, your little segment headers, and then you can go over to another bank. You can add in for a different show that you do or a different project that you're working on. And you can kind of just keep going from there. So the way you mix and match and use those sound banks is totally up to you, but it just turns these 8 pads basically into 64 pads. And this ability to save different sound banks kind of extends onto the desktop application that goes with the Rodecaster, where you can actually save an entire show. So if you have all of your settings, all your levels, if you have the specific, mics that you're using on each channel, you have your banks of audio clips, and you have it saved on a Rodecaster that you're sharing with someone, and then they go to do their show and they erase all of your settings. Now all you can do is just load your show back on, and then immediately all your settings are right there, good to go. So a lot of the 2.0 functionality really works well for environments where the Rodecaster is being used by a lot of people. And when it comes to the interface, Rode did do a few things to make everything overall a little bit cleaner and neater. Just like I said in my initial review for the Rodecaster, the touch interface works really well. There's no delay, there's no funkiness. It really is just as responsive as like a smartphone or a tablet. So it does everything you would expect it to do, and that makes using it a lot easier. They changed some of the icons, like the record icon and the marker icon, so that way they just stick out and you know exactly what's happening a lot more easily. If you go into each individual channel, you then have the option to change settings on that particular channel. And just like you always could, you can change the microphone that you're using, you can adjust the level, you can go in and adjust your voice. They sort of clean this menu up a little bit in terms of how you decide what strength of voice you're using, what tone you want for that voice, and then how you mix it all together and which settings you're using. It's all very clean, simple, and easy. You can totally do it on the fly. For channels 1 through 4, that's not hugely different, but for the USB, the smartphone, and the Bluetooth channels, this is actually different because now on each of those, you can go in and adjust the level, which is something you couldn't do before. And there's also presets. So for example, you can say, is it going to be a phone call? Is it going to be voice? Is it going to be music? And then the equalizer will adjust for those specific settings. One of the features I haven't yet had a chance to play with has to do with phone calls, where now when you use the mute and solo buttons on like the Bluetooth channel, if somebody's calling in, you can actually talk to them in real time without it affecting the recording. So if you're recording a show and somebody calls in for an interview, you can have the show continue to record. You can have somebody talking to the person on the phone, prepping them for the interview or how long it's going to be until they're on the air. And those two bits of audio are not going to overlap. Jumping back into the interface, you can go into the hardware menu where you have a few more options for the physical Rodecaster than you did in the past. You can adjust the brightness of the screen, how bright it is when it's active, when it's inactive. You can go into your headphones, you can limit the maximum volume, you can boost the maximum volume of your headphones. This is where you can do your Bluetooth pairing, which is just as simple as it's always been. And you can also now go in and adjust some of your audio settings. This entire section wasn't here before. So for example, you can go into the USB channel, you can adjust exactly how that's going to function. You can adjust your monitor outputs. You can turn off the level knob. So if you don't want that to affect a monitor output and you want to just hear exactly what the level is, you can now do that. You can turn on PFL, pre-fade listen. Basically, they just added the kind of features you would typically find in a much more expensive mixer. You can also go into multi-track and adjust some of those settings now directly within the Rodecaster, which again, something you just couldn't do before. Rode has also said that they just kind of went through and re-evaluated the sound engines to make things a little cleaner and clearer. I've always thought that the Rodecaster was incredibly quiet. If I stop talking, there's just like no noise. But apparently they've even improved that a bit more, and the way that it processes voice and inputs from different microphones. And all of these 2.0 updates come on top of the 1.0 version updates that Rode had continued to roll out since the Rodecaster's release, including things like record pause, which was a feature that I said was missing in my first review. They ended up actually adding that in a previous firmware update. So now if you're recording and you hold down the record button for 2 seconds, it will pause the recording, and then you just press it another time and it will start the recording back up. That is hugely useful. For me personally, I think that there's only one feature still missing, and I fully admit that this might be just totally personal to my needs and my workflow, but I would really like the ability to record directly as an MP3 within the Rodecaster. And I know that that sounds crazy at first, because the whole thing about the Rodecaster is that it does really high quality audio, and now I'm saying I wish there were a feature that kind of decreased the audio quality a little bit. But the reason for that is because when I upload podcasts, and especially if it's to a service like Anchor, they usually need to be in an MP3 format. And my favorite part personally about the Rodecaster is that it lets me do everything for an audio project or a podcast without any editing. So I can record directly, I can bring in all these different inputs, I can bring in sounds and clips, and then just as soon as I stop recording, my podcast is done and ready to go. But since it is a WAV file, that means I have to put it into something like Adobe Audition, then convert it to an MP3, and then upload it. It's a super first world problem, and honestly, it only takes like 2 minutes. But it is just one extra step, whereas if I could produce an MP3 directly in here, I could just take the SD card, put it in the computer, and upload directly and be ready to go. Like literally within a couple minutes of finishing a podcast, it could be up and available online. That's really the only feature for me that I think is still missing, and I fully acknowledge that it might not be something that a lot of people need. This 2.0 firmware update, I think, really shows that Rode listens to its customers and their needs. A lot of the functionality and features and new things that have been added, not only in this update, but even in the previous updates, are things that I think a lot of other companies honestly would save for a 2.0 hardware version. And so you'd have to buy the Rodecaster Pro 2 in order to get all of those features, whereas they released this one It's a new, different type of device, and they just keep adding functionality to it that makes it better and better. This is one of the most innovative and fun, interesting tools that I've found in the past few years. And I'm so excited about how easy it makes everything. And I'm so excited to see where they continue to take it in the future. If you want to know more about it, I do have my full Rodecaster Pro review. Of course, it was before the 2.0 firmware update, but all of my thoughts and feelings are either the same or even better as they were in that initial review.